Hi everyone, this is Frank DeMora, and this is the End Time Research Minister reporting, giving you up-to-date news about what's going on. Now we're going to start off with Israel, because Israel is going to be the earmark of the last days, because God is using this tiny nation that He will sanctify His holy name during the end times on this little nation. And He's going to be protecting this nation. And many people would like to see Israel completely destroyed, but that's never going to happen. God will not allow that to happen. So we know that Zechariah chapter 12, you'll see it here in verse 3, where the Lord showed us that in the last days everybody was going to come against Israel. And of course, anybody who burdened themselves as you see in the scripture, burdened themselves over Jerusalem, the Jews, then they would be cut into pieces. Now, I know that the United States of America is definitely burdening themselves. Let me give you a little bit of information about what's going on in the Middle East in relation to Israel and some of the other Arab nations that are going to be very significant in the last days. You'll see the first one that I'm going to bring up here. This is really important. I wanted to show you the news that came out today on June 18th, 2013 from the Jerusalem Post. The Hamas and Hezbollah leave Syria and focus on fighting Israel instead. It says the Hamas and the Hezbollah involvement inflames sectarian conflict in Syria. The Saudis supply anti-aircraft missiles to the rebels. And of course, this news comes out of Gaza's Palestinians Islamic Hamas movement on Monday urged the Lebanese militant group Hezbollah to withdraw its forces from Syria, where they are battling the Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, and focus on fighting Israel instead. And this is what I've been warning about for some time now. So, goes on to say that the Hamas, which controls the Gaza Strip, was once an Assad ally, but last year endorsed the revolt against him in a shift at that time deprived the Syrian leader of an important Sunni Muslim supporter in the Arab world. We call on Hezbollah to take its forces out of Syria and keep their weapons directed against the Zionist enemy. And this doesn't come to any surprise at all to me. I've been warning you that this is what's going to happen. Eventually, we know that it's going to turn into the Psalm 83 war, because look at who's involved. We're talking about the Hamas. We're talking about the Hezbollah. We're talking about Lebanon, the Lebanese, right? And we see that, Saudi Arabia is giving missiles to these people. So every one of these, and of course Syria is also involved in the Psalm 83 war against Israel. It says on Friday, Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah promised his group would keep fighting alongside Assad's forces after it spearheaded the recapture of the strategic town of Qasr. Hamas leaders in exile were once based in Damascus but left, and mainly for Egypt and Qatar in 2012 as the Civil War escalated. And here you go, the Saudis supplying the missiles to the Syrian rebels. Now, if you're new to Bible prophecy, one thing that you have to understand in Bible prophecy is that the same people that I just read to you, here you have Egypt, and you got Lebanon, you got the Saudis, who are giving the, as you can see right here from number 2, Ishmael was the father of the Arabs, and of course you have the Palestinians, Hezbollah and the Hamas, and the Gaza Strip, the Palestinians, right here. So everyone in that article is in the news today. And it doesn't come surprise, because they all want to get rid of Israel. And many times I've been telling you that the whole problem in the Middle East right now, the breakdown or the stalled peace agreement, all has to do with the 1967 borders. Let me go to this article and elaborate a little bit on that. I'll make this a little bit, hopefully a little bit bigger for you. Hold on. Israel go back to the 1967 borders, and of course, I don't believe that it will ever happen. Let me get rid of this. It says, John Kerry's mission in jeopardy. The United States continues to put pressure on the Israelis and the Palestinians in order to speed up the resumption of peace talks suspended in 2010. This week, U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry was going to visit the Middle East, but his visit was postponed because of the consultations on Syria in the White House. And I mentioned this about 5 days ago, that meeting was postponed. In other words, John Kerry is holding back traveling to the Middle East until they get all these consultations taken care of. The attempts to resolve the Palestinian-Israeli conflict have not been effective so far, despite many efforts by the Western politicians and diplomats. And from the very beginning, Israel has not been very enthusiastic about the peace initiatives of John Kerry, who supported the idea to return to the 1967 borders. And this is, again, this is dangerous for the United States because the United States falls under the Genesis chapter 12, the Joel chapter 3, verse 2, and also the Zechariah chapter 12, verse 3 curse. Or anybody who comes against Israel or tries to divide up Israel will be cut into pieces. So that's exactly what John Kerry is doing under the direction of Barack Obama. 1967 borders in exchange for peace with the Arab countries. There's not going to be any peace. We know that because the prophecies tell us that there's going to be sudden destruction when they're calling for peace, and it doesn't say anything about having peace when they're calling for peace. The Israeli government supports the resumption of negotiations with the Palestinians without any preliminary conditions. And I've been telling you this is the stance that Benjamin Netanyahu has taken. He said that he was never going to give up East Jerusalem, so I don't see these peace talks going anywhere. And of course, when we're dealing with the peace talks, you'll see that other nations are also throwing in their 2 cents. Austria may delay peacekeepers' withdrawal from the Golan. It says nearly 70 Austrian peacekeepers have already returned, leaving just over 300 in the Golan as the UN urgently tries to plug the looming gap in the observer mission known as the UN DOF. Austria may withdraw its peacekeeping troops from the Golan Heights, moving slowly than first planned, that allow the UN extra time to arrange an orderly handover. Now, we know that there was some fighting recently right on the border between Israel and Syria, and many of the UN forces pulled out. And we'll see that here. It says, we are still going to pull out, but the question of how and when has to be negotiated with the UN. So, in the midst of, the stalled peace talks, we see other nations involved, and they're being killed, and they're pulling people out. And of course, nothing is going to change, obviously, until we see the Psalm 83 war conflict come into fruition. Now, the Palestinian Authority is accusing Israel of declaring death to the two-state solution. And I've been talking about this for some time. I kept saying, if you remember, that when the PLO finally realizes that there's not going to be any peace negotiation and is going to give them back the land that they lost in the 1967 war, that they'll leave the peace talks and they'll obviously turn to violence, war, and that war will end up being the war that was prophesied in the Psalm 83. Look at this. Israel has officially declared the death of a two-state solution. The chief Palestinian negotiator Sheba Ekrat said Monday in a response to the economy minister Naftali Bennett's claim that the two-state solution had reached a dead end. So we're seeing the same kind of news. It goes on, and it will continue to go on and on. These are the birth pangs of the last days, the peace talks, if you will, the birth pangs of those failed peace talks. Now here's another article. I will seek a demilitarized Palestinian state, says Netanyahu, economy and the trade minister. Again, we're talking about the same people who are in the last article that I brought up, remarks that the two-state solution has reached a dead end, prompting anger responses from both the Palestinian Authority and the Israeli coalition. And the PA's official Bennett's comments are dangerous. Obviously they are, because they're pointing to what we already know that's coming, war. One day after Economy and Trade Minister Naftali Bennett declared that the notion of a two-state solution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict have reached a dead end, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu issued a response to the controversial statement on Monday, saying the foreign policy is shaped by the Prime Minister, and my view was clear. I will seek a negotiating settlement with the Palestinians where you would like to have a demilitarized Palestinian state that recognizes the Jewish state, Netanyahu told Reuters when asked about Bennett's remarks. Now, the Palestinians have resisted Netanyahu's call for such recognition, fearing it would be tantamount to waiving any right of return for the Palestinian refugees. Netanyahu was not the only leader to react to Bennett's statement. The Palestinian Authority was up in arms on Monday with the associates of the Palestinian Authority, President Ahmad Abbas, warning that Bennett's remarks was dangerous. So this is the cabinet minister in a government whose policy is to expand settlements and to avoid the peace process, said one of the Abbas advisors. So, again, status quo. No peace talks, stalled, if you will, continue to be stalled. Threats going from one side to the other, from the Palestinians to the Israelis, and vice versa. So what do we expect? Obviously, if you know what to expect, we know that other people will be involved in the talks, the Middle East peace talks, because that's what we see in the scriptures when it talked about the call for peace and safety, and that's when the sudden destruction comes, just as it says in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5. And of course, the ex-president, President Clinton, who worked in his administration to divide up Israel, he's doing it again. Now, Zechariah, let me go back here if you will, because remember what I showed you about Zechariah? Anybody who burdens themselves are going to be cut into pieces. Well, Clinton tried it back then, and he had a lot of issues. He had some major things take place where you can see the curse of God falling on him and the country. And he's still pushing this curse. Maybe he doesn't know it, but he's definitely pushing a curse on the United States. Look at this. Israel must make peace or disappear. And of course, Zechariah said that everyone was going to come against Israel. And essentially what Clinton is saying is the same thing that the ex-president is saying. And I'm just going to read in the bold writing here. It says, in a speech that will no doubt incentive Palestine or the Palestinians to continue their campaign of terror and welfare against Israel, former President Bill Clinton told Israel that it would have to make peace with the Palestinians if it wanted to remain a Jewish and democratic. It's like, wow. So what you're telling us, Mr. President, or ex-Mr. President, is that Israel, in your opinion, is going to disappear? Well, apparently you don't know the word of the Lord. And apparently you don't know how the Lord is holding Israel in its hands, and he's going to protect this nation. And by saying this, Mr. President, I would really be very, very careful when you say this, because you heap the curse of God upon yourself, and you heap it on the nation that you represent, and that's the United States, the curse. Now it goes on to say that he said that thanks to the demographic changes, Israel will have to separate from the Palestinian population in order to maintain its majority. Let's read a little bit more. This theory has been proved falsely repeatedly. Israel's demographic majority in Israel will remain strong for decades upon decades. But the goal of the left is to create pressure on Israel. And of course, this is essentially what I've been telling you, that Barack Obama and of course Bill Clinton, he's following suit. He's the one that led the way for Barack Obama, and he's doing the same thing as Bill Clinton. Says the party willing to come to the negotiating table while doing nothing whatsoever with regard to the Palestinians. In the point of fact, all that Clinton's speech will do is ensure the Palestinians do not come to the table. After all, if Israel will be destroyed unless it capitulates, what is the incentive for the Palestinians to deal? So again, just other news pointing to Zechariah chapter 12, the call for peace and safety and the sudden destruction. Of course, obviously, the curse that will ensue on anyone who comes against Israel. Israel will not be destroyed like the president said, but it will remain a nation. God will not allow all those people to be destroyed. And of course, you'll see some other news about China stepping in with this two-state solution. So keep an eye on the United States, keep an eye on China, and anyone else who comes against the people of Israel, the Jews, because natural disasters will fall upon these nations, no doubt about it. So thank you. This is Frank DeMoore from the End Times Research Ministry saying watch the news, because there's so much news. Prophecy being fulfilled and leading up to the prophecies that haven't been fulfilled, like the Psalm 83 war. It's coming so fast it's hard to give it to you all at once.